Welcome everyone. My name is Scott Adams and along with my co-host, Associate Professor Negan Miriahi, and on behalf of the Higher Education Research Group of Adelaide, we welcome you to today's HERGA seminar, How Does Artificial Intelligence Fit in Education? It's my privilege to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Kaurna people of the Adelaide region, and also acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia where others may be viewing today's live stream. We pay our respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures, to the elders past and present, and we recognise their continuing connection to lands, waters and communities.
You've all probably noticed the recent proliferation of webinars, presentations, articles, blogs, you name it, on artificial intelligence and its impact on education and society. And as today's presenters will be discussing, and for really good reason, it is arguably the most important factor impacting the landscape of higher education at this time. And given the plethora of offerings on this topic, the HERGA team, thanks to Scott, have chosen to do something a bit different in today's seminar by inviting experts who focus on AI and its impact on education from a range of perspectives to present on their work, but also to answer your questions specifically on this topic. So any burning questions that you have on AI and its impact on education now and moving forward, you'll be able to ask our esteemed panel here today.
So today's seminar will commence with each of our 4 panel members providing a brief presentation of the nature of their work surrounding artificial intelligence, followed by some questions of Negan and I, and then finishing with an opportunity for those in the audience, both physically and via our YouTube live stream, to ask questions of our presenters. So our virtual attendees engaging with the seminar via YouTube, you'll be able to log in via Slido and ask your questions there, and Negan and I will relay them live in the room. There's a QR code and a numerical Slido code for you to log in and to join Slido for the purpose of asking those questions. So it's now our pleasure to introduce our presenters.
Our first presenter will be Professor George Siemens. George is the director of the Centre for Change and Complexity in Learning at the University of South Australia. His research work spans across the topic of networks, analytics, and human and artificial and cognition, specifically in education. Our second panelist today is Associate Professor Edward Palmer from the School of Education within the Faculty of Arts, Business, Law, and Economics at the University of Adelaide. He has 30 years of experience in teaching and learning across a wide range of disciplines and is the convener of HERGA, a community of over 1,000 education researchers in South Australia, and I learned today has been around for 18 years and is a South Australian branch leader for HERGA as well.
Our third panellist is Dr. Kuan Liung Tan. He's a UniSA academic with a wealth of experience in both the health and education sectors. His current research interests are in telehealth, digital health, and teleclinical trials, and he is actively using artificial intelligence to enhance his lecture materials and assessments. Our fourth panellist is Dr. Narelle Hunter, and she is the Senior Academic Integrity Officer for the College of Science and Engineering at Flinders University, working with students and staff to ensure that the ethics and integrity of teaching and learning is upheld, including identifying artificial intelligence misuse.
I'd like to welcome Professor George Siemens to present on the imperative for universities to understand and respond to AI. Over to you, George.
Great, thank you. Thanks everyone for the privilege of your time, and thanks for the hosts and getting things organized and arranged. I think you're going to see in this AI conversation landscape a growing range of perspectives emerging. Some of those perspectives are going to be reserved and saying, you know, we've seen this before, we've had different technologies before. Some may be getting a little bit excited about what AI might do in the conversation, and some you'd fit into the hypester, overly enthusiastic, this changes everything crowd. I'm firmly in that camp. I'm firmly, just to declare my bias up front, I think there are things that we have seen emerging in society, and there's different frameworks you can look at this, whether it's Thomas Kuhn's notion of ordinary and extraordinary science, where anomalies collect, the existing system or paradigm in his terminology doesn't account for those anomalies, and then over time you have, for lack of a better word, a phase change. You have a new regime, a new framework for how we understand the world in front of us based on this collection of anomalies. And so my lens isn't just that AI is an important thing to worry about or to think about or to understand. I would say it's the only thing. It is the thing that matters most in the world today from all perspectives: economic, institutional, social. There's no dynamic in which AI doesn't have some level of impact. Now, there's significant implications of that particular stance. So on the one hand, I do think we are going to see, over in the near term at least, a proliferation of harms being generated by easily accessible tools. You might recall a number of years ago when OpenAI first started developing their GPT models. One of the statements they made is, we can't release this to the public, because if it's released to the public, it's too powerful and state-level actors will begin to misuse this technology. Now, that was before they found a good revenue model, in which case, we'll see what happens. And so you might have seen this week, there was a group of individuals that met on Capitol Hill in the US to get interrogated by ill-informed lawmakers to ask softball questions that didn't really get at the significant harm issues. But we're really in a type of a game theory situation. You might recall a few months ago, someone said, hey, a group of people said we need to pause this research. We need to do a better job of making sense of where these technologies are going and what the implications of those technologies are. Obviously, that went nowhere, because the game that we're in is, if you stop developing AI, you have to assume everyone else in the world stops developing AI. Obviously, that's not going to happen. And state-level actors are not interested in following by rules other than preserving their own national boundaries, their own national interests. So I just want to say, as a little bit of a landscape, that's my lens, is that AI is the most significant thing for us to figure out. The impacts on a number of different sectors of society, at least in the short term. I can think of nothing else that will have a greater impact on the long-term success or suffering of humanity than getting that part of the equation right. I also think that we have seen pre-AI a lot of things happening societally that we've ill-adjusted to. For example, our universities, many of you, if you've ever had a child apply to get into university, we haven't structured universities for students. We've structured it for faculty or for administrators. And there's ways that entire system should be reconfigured. That predates AI. We have a course-based model that we all know doesn't account for informal learning that people experience in their daily lives. Again, that predates AI. We have a number of things operationally, procedurally, and practically that are misaligned to the ways that individuals live their lives today as universities. That predates AI. That's the first section. I just want to say, that's the landscape. This is the challenge we're up against. It's not AI that's the thing we're reacting to. It's ongoing technological development over 20 years that the system of education hasn't meaningfully aligned to. Then we look at, well, let's think of some of the theorists that have said interesting things in the education landscape. And this goes back 20, 30, 40 years. You can go right back to Dewey. You can go back to people like Bell Hooks, who've written about the social and the philosophical implications of the education sector. But if you just take a few theorists, what has somebody like Keller's personalized system of instruction? What did he intend to do with that? Well, the goal was, we need a mastery-based model of learning where you know what everybody knows, a competency-based approach. Fantastic idea. Can't deploy it. Why? Too expensive. Data collection, monitoring, tracking students is cost prohibitive, so that doesn't work. Well, then you get Benjamin Bloom. He writes his famous paper on the 2 sigma difference, basically saying that, hey, if you take a student who's a good student and you provide her with proper tutoring, she'll be an excellent student. So we know that. Good relationship between the knower and the person who desires to know, you can enormously raise the performance. Can't do it. Why? That requires almost a 1-to-1, 2-to-1, 3-to-1 relationship with students and teachers. Fantastic idea. Can't do it. Ivan Illich, even grumpier than Paulo Freire ever was, wrote a paper, or a book, I should say, that called Deschooling Society. He has a chapter in there he calls them learning webs. Basically introduces the idea of peer-based learning as a means to reduce costs and the overall impact of the education sector, raising student performance, raising overall success. Doesn't happen. Why? Far too expensive to deploy. So now that's just a cluster of 3 things. So I'll make a statement here that says we have no new ideas in education. We have new avenues to realize fantastic existing ideas. Competency-based learning models, personalized learning, personalized tutors, adaptive learning. There's frameworks that we can now deploy at scale that the people who theorized them initially were only able to conceive but weren't able to enact. Through AI, my argument, and the related affiliated technologies that have been developing over the last 20 to 30 years, we can create personal profiles of any individual student in our classrooms. We can, and you're seeing just glimmers of this with ChatGPT or Bard or a range of tools. Conmigo, we recently did a webinar with a chief learning officer from the Khan Academy, and by we I mean GRAIL, Global Research Alliance for AI in Learning and Education, which UniSA was a founding member of. They talked about how they developed their chatbot based on the ChatGPT infrastructure, providing tutored, guided support for individuals with fantastic success. Saul Khan, I was on a panel with him recently at a conference in San Diego, and he said his kids preferred Conmigo as a tutor to him. So, I mean, if your kids are, there's a way of interacting with this interface that's significant and substantive. So I'll just make the final point here before I pass along to Edward, is that we have a system that is ill-matched to the needs of modern learners, and those ill matches have been accruing really since the development of technology, but more profoundly since the internet. Secondly, we have a growing range of visions, ideas, and concepts that are fantastically grounded in pedagogy, proper vision, and research. They're going in the same direction as well. Now we have a set of technologies that are sophisticated, impactful, and meaningful, that have the capability now to resoundly advance that concept of education. So from my end, we are, for lack of a better word, no longer and will no longer be the smartest entity in the world. We are going to be part of systems that are intelligent. Our co-learners will be AI agents, and this is the worst they'll ever get. These systems will only get better and only become more sophisticated. So if you're impressed now, you'll be way more impressed in a year's time. If you're worried now, you'll be way more worried in a year's time. And so I think I'm an unabashed optimist in the positive effects of this, and I unabashedly state that this is the most consequential thing we as a society need to understand. Oh, I'm going to clap.
I just want to thank Scott for putting me directly after George. I appreciate that. For those of you online who've got access to your computers, it's probably worth having a look at some of George's work on connectivism. I see that as being something which is going to be directly relevant to us over the coming years, so it's definitely worth having a look at. So I knew that George was probably going to hit most of the points that I wanted to hit. So I thought, instead of doing that, I'm just going to tell a story. So, as a good academic story, they typically start off with a student. So let's start off with one of my students. So one of my students is doing some PhD work. She decides that she wants to investigate the learning of language, in particular German in this case. And she's decided that she wants to look at a personalised model based on mobile devices. So she starts preparing all that sort of work. And somewhere along the line, she suddenly realises that all the apps that she's looking at are now on the endangered list. They essentially don't have much relevance anymore because AI is going to do a much better job of interacting. People can practice their vocabulary, they can practice their reading and their writing using these tools. So pivot, all very good. Then she starts having a look at the way we're teaching. And she sees the teaching's good, but she sees the assessment as being hugely problematic all of a sudden. She sees the essays and the reports. All the things that we use for summative tasks are suddenly all compromised. And she's absolutely right. So, my story's about the things that make me worry. This is not one of them. I'm not worried about that. The moment AI hit the skids on about, 20 years ago probably, when essays could be marked by artificial instruction, sooner or later we knew we were going to head to a point where it was going to be able to do some of the things that we do, and it was going to be able to do it better. And it's already there to some extent. So I'm not too worried about the fact that our assessments are going to have to be looked at really, really closely by all of us. I'm not too worried the fact that our summative assessments on essays and reports are essentially completely and utterly compromised. And academic integrity issues as a philosophy aside, they've actually not been the best things we've been running with in the past anyway. Essentially, one of the things that the universities don't do very well is assessment. So this is a great opportunity for us to actually revisit the whole thing that we're doing, understand why we're doing it, and it's not to collect marks. Our goal here is actually to achieve learning outcomes. Okay, so I'm not worried about that. My student then says, okay, I want to do something really interesting in the classroom here. What about doing some role plays? Now, role plays are quite good, but if anyone who's ever tried to do those sorts of things realise that there's days of effort required to get the scenario right, to get all the roles that are actually going to be used as part of that role play environment correct, and to make sure that you actually can ask some decent questions around it, which is going to provoke appropriate learning. And she looks at me and says, "Was that okay?" And I said, "Well, actually, I'm not worried about that either, because AI is going to be able to generate these things for me really quickly." And I just demonstrated it very fast. Generated a whole scenario, generated all the role-playing role statements in about 2 minutes. Yes, they need refinement, but essentially it's broken the back on a day and a half's worth of work. So we've got our role-playing going. That's all wonderful. And we talk about how we're going to actually assess this. And we think, okay, well, we could put everyone in a room and they can just practice their German skills there, or we can send them off on their way and give some AI work. So they basically are going to go and they're going to collect their role plays, they're going to enter the roles and the statements into the AI engines, they're going to interrogate it in a Socratic way. Because essentially what they've got now is they've got the professor in their pocket. And it's not just one professor, they've got every professor in their pocket if they want it, in every different field. So there's a huge opportunity there for them to engage. They can put in their German, it can correct their German. They can, at some point, very, very close, they'll be able to speak their German. It will transcribe it appropriately. It will then be able to tell them where their pronunciation is not correct. So they can do all of these sorts of things. And then the head of school comes along and says, well, that's great, except how are we going to know that they've done the work? And how will we know that they've learned anything? And they're not the same thing, right? The fact that they've learned something does not necessarily match with the fact that we've assessed them on something, which may or may not marry up to it. So am I worried? No, I'm not worried, because this is where we come into it. We're back into the picture again. Because yes, we can run exams, yes, we can enclose people in boxes and get them to just practice their skills. But what we can also do is we can actually leverage the time that AI is going to provide us to actually generate some really significant live environment testings and experiences. So we bring all our students in, they've practiced all their role playing online with the AI, they say they're competent, they feel they're competent, and now they get to practice it in an authentic environment. We decide, look, we want to be able to assess this properly because we have to have an assurance of quality. We're going to bring multiple tutors in there because we've saved so much time on our role-playing statements, giving feedback to the students because they're getting it automatically from the Socratic method they're using with the AI. And we mark them live. We interact with them, we give them some live feedback. And when they walk out of that room, both they and us understand what level of learning they've achieved. So if I'm not worried about any of that, what am I actually worried about? Right? Is academic integrity? I'm about as worried about academic integrity and AI as I am about the sun not going down tonight and coming up tomorrow. I don't think there is anything we can actually do about it, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. Sooner or later, students and AI, well, they can already do it. Students don't know enough yet to know how to get around the AI engines. But sooner or later, we won't be able to detect who's used it and who hasn't used it. So that, for me, is a pathway that's not worth going down. Academic integrity as a concept and as an active philosophy for students is absolutely critical, but I'm not worried about it. What I'm worried about is some results of some preliminary research we've just done at the University of Adelaide, where we found that 1/3 of our staff are not planning to look at artificial intelligence. Another third are unsure about whether they want to do it. And 75% of the people that want to do it are desperate for some training in it because they don't understand it well enough. And I've already talked about the fact that universities don't do assessment very well. Well, the other thing we don't do very well is professional development for our academics. So these are the things that worry me a little bit, but AI in itself, it's a great opportunity for us to actually change the things that should have been changed 30 years ago. Right. Thank you.
Thanks, Edward. You're a very good storyteller. There's a nice segue to Kuan as Edward spoke about an example of leveraging AI to get better learning outcomes for students. Kuan's going to talk about some examples of doing just that with his classes and how he uses generative AI to improve his assessments and his lectures. So thanks, Kuan.
Thank you, Scott. Thanks, Edward. I want to follow up with your point that academics are actually not really prepared. 1/3 of them are actually not planning to use AI. So that's what I found as well when I asked people around me. There are a couple of academics who are ahead of the curve who really use the tool almost on a daily basis. There are academics who use it perhaps once or twice per week. And there are also people who have heard about it but not used it at all. So I have this overarching or guiding principle for myself that as an educator, I have a responsibility, and it is my obligation to show other people, especially my students, how to use AI and how to use it wisely. And to do it, I have to use it myself, and I have to use it frequently. And to that end, for this purpose, we have a bunch of enthusiastic health academics within UniSA who started a community of practice. So we are looking at a bottom-up approach to this problem. We want to provide a safe environment for people to share their experiences and to record their experiences and share it with the wider community, so that we create sort of a non-judgmental space for people to feel safe to come in and demonstrate their ideas, and also recognizing that all of us have a different starting point. Now, personally, for myself, I've used AI to improve my teaching materials. So let me just share a few examples. So one example is I have a lecture around budgeting models in healthcare. So I put my lecture draft up to ChatGPT, a generative AI tool, as you know, to tell me where the gaps are and how I can actually improve on those lecture materials. And it's able to tell me that my lecture is very dry, too many dot points, and maybe insert a visual model here on slide 8, insert a case study on slide 10, and insert a quiz on slide 12, right? Let's go to slide 8, the visual model. So it suggested to me that I need to have a Venn diagram of the budgeting models. So I asked, what is a Venn diagram and how it applies to my situation? And it's able to tell me you have 3 common budgeting models in healthcare. And number 1 is the flexible model. This is what I teach as well. So flexible budgeting model, there's a historical budgeting model, as well as there is a zero-based budgeting model. So it said to me, you have to draw 3 circles. Yes, that's obvious. For a Venn diagram, you have to have 3 circles. But it's able to tell me in the cross-section what I need to put in there. For each crossover duplication between the 2 circles, what concept should be in there and what should be separate from each other. So that's how clever it is. Even though it cannot draw the diagram itself, not yet. In future, there will be tools that allow it to draw diagrams, but it's able to describe diagram in detail for me. The second example I would like to give is that it's able to suggest that I put a case study on my slide 10. And I said, well, that's great, but what sort of case study should I put in there? And I said to it, well, maybe you should write that case study for me. And it did that, and it did it with really, it's at a reasonable quality. I still need to go in and refine it myself because it's almost like 70–80% done, but it's able to do it at really quickly, like a high speed, like within seconds that I'm able to get a good draft out of it. So that's a second example. Third example was I also teach a project course, right? A project-based course, and the students have to work with an industry partner, and for that project, they need to analyze survey data, right? And the problem with that they faced then was that the industry partner couldn't give them the data on time because of some bureaucratic mix-up. So I said to ChatGPT, well, you are good at hallucinating. Maybe hallucinate, give me some synthetic data, some fake data. So it managed to look at the survey questions, generate some really fake data, but really close to what real-world people would respond to the survey. And then I've been able to get my students to refine their tools, to look at qualitative data analysis tools, refine their tools on that synthetic data, And then when the actual data from the industry partner actually came in, they were able to apply what they've learned on using the analysis tools on the fake data on the real data itself with great success. So in actual fact, it saved them some time because they don't have to sit around waiting for the real data to come in. And I can see that approach being generalizable to a first-year data analytics course, for example, where students are asked to create a set of survey questions and maybe get ChatGPT to generate some answers, and then get the students to refine their analytical models on those answers. So these are the 3 examples that I want to share today, but it's just scratching the surface of what the tool can do. And I would like to borrow a phrase from Edward. Like, it's almost like having a professor in your pocket, but this is almost like having a teaching assistant in your pocket as well. And that teaching assistant won't grow tired. It will be able to serve you 24/7. And you'll be able to use it to improve your materials as time goes on. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Kuan. So far we've heard about the importance of AI and about the haste in which we need to start dealing with it. It's really great to hear from Kuan about ways in which he is using it for his teaching practice. Promised you multiple lenses today. So our 4th presenter is going to, Dr. Narelle Hunter is the Senior Academic Integrity Officer, and whilst Edward said he's not scared of academic integrity, some of us may be. So we'll invite Narelle to speak about the interplay between AI and AI.
Thank you, Scott. It's actually been really refreshing hearing how everybody's incorporating AI in really positive ways and using that with teaching, because a lot of the things that I see in my role are obviously when staff are incredibly worried about how students are misusing AI, and I can assure you they're already all using a lot of generative AI. If you think you're not seeing it, it's just because it's sliding under the radar. I don't want that to be something big and scary, because this is something that we're going to have to naturally embrace. And whilst it might be a very big flip in terms of how we're assessing students, I do think that's really overdue. The kinds of approaches we've used have really become outdated, and it's about time we really shake that up. What we're looking at the moment with generative AI is the quality of assessments that we're basing on. It can do really, really well, incredibly well, particularly at our 1st and 2nd year levels. It's producing essays and case studies and all sorts of material that is better than most of our 1st year students can produce already. So where we're kind of looking at is, what do we need to do in terms of informing students and staff appropriate ways to use it, figuring out what we do in the gap where we don't want them to use it, and what that looks like. And that is a little bit scary, I gotta say, because that's really hard work. But that's why we will not be out of a job. So that's not something that I think AI will ever be able to do particularly well, because we need to work out what it actually is that we want our students to learn and what's important, and how they're going to be able to demonstrate that they've actually gained that learning. So I don't think it actually means plugging in new tools. We've got, most of our institutions have existing policy that actually works really, really well. It's more about thinking about how we talk with our students and make them very aware of the expectations and requirements and how we're going to actually assess that. So at Flinders, we have we haven't needed to change our policies at all, because we did have already embedded acknowledgement of the use of artificial intelligence kind of tools. It fits into plagiarism and contract cheating. But if that policy wording isn't exactly right, I don't think it actually matters. The general gist of academic integrity policies is that the students are submitting their own work that they created in an honest manner, an honest and ethical manner. If we're communicating to students really clearly what the expectations are, and then align our assessment processes with those expectations, I don't think we've actually got a lot to worry about. So what we've done at Flinders is set up a traffic light system. Green traffic light, use AI pretty much however you want. Amber traffic light, we're going to limit the ways we expect you to use it, and here's what those limitations are. And a red traffic light, we don't want you to use it at all. Now, the red traffic light, I will expect that we probably won't use that very often, but we might use that in cases where we have invigilated exams and those kinds of things. But we seem to be moving more towards the uptake of using generative AI and having students actually acknowledge it. And that's where our policies and some of the groundwork has had to be transformed, because our students need to know how to acknowledge and incorporate generative AI just like they would when they've had to learn how to reference. It's actually not vastly different. So this is not something that I think we should all be terrified of. It's the same kinds of things we've had to teach our students in the past. It's just looking at it from a slightly different perspective. In terms of what to do, though, if our students are misusing it, and that's going to happen, and it's going to happen an awful lot. There are so many competing things going on in students' lives that the temptation to misuse generative AI is going to be there. It already is. I have seen an increase. I had a quick look last night, about 40-fold increase in reports of the same kind of criteria from this time last year. That is enormous. And academic integrity is a tiny fraction of my role. It's now, it's blowing up in terms of the support I'm having to offer to other staff. And I guess lucky I'm quite passionate about it, so I'm happy to offer that advice. There's a whole bunch of technology out there that claim to be able to detect generative AI, and that's the part that concerns me, is they're making these wild claims, and even to this moment, they're hosting those claims of up to 98% accuracy on their sites, things like Turnitin, have a GPT detection, GPT-0, there's a whole bunch of others. This level of accuracy, I think, is misrepresenting what we're truly seeing. I would always advise that that is one tiny piece of the puzzle if you're worried about students misusing generative AI. There's so many other aspects that need to be investigated, and yes, they do take a bit of time and a little bit of investigation, but the way we can minimise that is by setting up our students to have evidence of their learning anyway. So if we encourage students to maintain regular drafts and keep versions of those, if we start encouraging them to use Google Docs that allow them to track the input that they've had over time, those kinds of things will allow a student to demonstrate that not only have they put significant effort into this piece of work, that that effort is their own, and even if they have used some generative AI, they can acknowledge where and how they've done so in different forms. Always, always, this has to happen with a conversation with the student. And something that we get out of that is an understanding of, can they articulate what they've written or produced in this report or case study, whatever it is? Do they actually have the ability to talk about what they potentially wrote about? Or is it more likely that they just pushed a button, entered a few prompts and spat out something in 2 minutes flat? So my work in the last, really has ramped up in the last couple of weeks, understanding how these tools are used, how we actually apply them, to investigating where students may have misused it. But what's really come out of that is how important it is to educate our students about the proper ways of using it, acknowledging how they've used it, and then being open and honest in their dealing with it.
Thank you, Narelle. The next phase of this seminar will be a question and answer. So we've got about 55 minutes, and for those of you that want to ask your questions, I encourage you to start thinking about them now. Those of you who are on the live stream, you can start logging into Slido and writing your questions, and we'll relay them in a moment to our panellists. But in the meantime, while you're doing that, Megan and I will kick off just with a couple. And while you've got the mic, Narelle, I might start with you. You spoke about the 40-fold increase in AI misuse, and I'm just wondering how easy it is to detect AI misuse, because you said some of it slips under the table. In addition, can AI itself help detect misuse of AI?
Yes and yes. So yes, can it be detected? Absolutely. These claims at the moment that we're seeing of 98% accuracy, there's a lot of caveats that come along with those claims, and if you investigate further what that actually means, it's not like, I think what we tend to do is, because we've had these Turnitin models to use for plagiarism that have these lovely clear matches to, well, this text matches this particular piece of work and here's that piece of work, that's a nice link. And you can have a conversation with a student about that and talk about effective ways to paraphrase and appropriate presentation and those kinds of things. Misuse of generative AI detection doesn't work that way. There's no clear link back to this has come from this source or this was produced on this day. It's looking at how likely it is that that text was generated using a software model as opposed to everyday human language. And yes, there are ways of detecting that, but it's nowhere near the accuracy as what we've seen in the past. So I think it's really tempting to slip back into that model of, oh, Turnitin said that here's a magical number of 95% or whatever it is, or 100% in many cases that I'm seeing. It's not that straightforward. There's interactions with all sorts of other AI models as well. And I think we forget that things like Grammarly, which often institutions are encouraging students to use, has some interaction with these detectors as well. And it's not really, given that these models are being paid for by institutions, they're not free models, there's a bit of an incentive from these providers to kind of knuckle down and say, no, it really isn't interacting. We've got a really concrete piece of evidence here for you, when I'm really not sure they do.
Yeah.
So always with not just a pinch of salt, a massive cup of salt when you're looking at those reports.
Thanks, Narelle. Over to George. George, you spoke about the impact of AI in all sectors of society. And only yesterday I had a meeting with the Australian Institute of Sport, where they too are using artificial intelligence to improve effectively the feedback loop between coach and athlete to try and win us some gold medals. So my question to you is, given that universities are tasked with producing job-ready graduates, how do you see AI transforming the workplace in the future, and what graduate capabilities will be required to meet the demand of AI in industry?
Sure. So in some levels, I think we're going to see a number of ready impacts, and we're not just going to, we're seeing them now. So BT today announced they were going to be laying off 55,000 people. 1/5 of those were directly due to AI technologies advancing. Yesterday I was reading about a group that does audiobooks, and they're laying off their entire audio narrative talent because AI can do the narration as well as humans can. Last week IBM announced they were going to discontinue hiring in 7,500 jobs, all of which would be replaced by AI. So I think there's an interesting dynamic, and that's just a quick sampling, but it's if you're in the creative industry, we were always told that the one thing where AI would not make an impact is in the creative sector. And it just goes to show you that your experts are idiots. And so, recently Jeffrey Hinton, who launched this current movement of AI, and some of you may have encountered this last week, he was left Google so he could better critique the trajectory here. And he had said something initially, he thought in 30 to 50 years we would start to see this idea of artificial general intelligence. So terminology, I mean, we're all sort of increasingly versed in AI literacies, but narrow AI is an AI task or a model that's been trained on something and does something well. So it can recognize this as a cat. When you're given X number of images, cancer detection algorithms, for example, don't suddenly write recipes for you. They're narrow in their intelligence. AGI means that it has human level capability, which means if I learn something in one domain, I can transfer at least part of it into another domain in a meaningful way. This is where you start to get an amplification of intelligence. So Hinton and others had at one point said this is far in the future. He used to say 30 to 50 years. Now he's saying, oh, I don't know, it might be a few years away, which is a totally different conversation. If anybody should know, it should be him, because he, along with Jan LeCun and Joshua Bengio, launched the current iteration we're in regarding neural networks and deep learning. So if that's the case, it's a fool's game to really say what will happen with these jobs, what will be needed in the labor market, because we didn't think creativity would be the first thing to fall in terms of labor market impacts. There have been a couple of reports written by individuals out of Stanford over the last few years that say, well, AI is going to not take jobs. There was Fay and Osborne, you might have seen reports or papers written about 3 or 4, maybe even 5 years ago, and they said, oh, a third of jobs are at risk due to AI and automation. That's come back. They were kind of wrong on almost all fronts that they had said it would happen. But now there's a growing interest that says, well, maybe not all jobs, but maybe parts of jobs, which means this skill set will still be needed, but this skill set is going to be taken over by AI. So short answer is we just don't know. We don't know how technologies will be implemented, and we don't know how humans will accept when these AI tools are implemented. Quick example, about 3 months ago, Vanderbilt University of the US, there was shockingly a shooting in the US. And the Vanderbilt group wanted to send condolences to their student population that said, hey, we're just wanting to reach out, there's help services available, And at the bottom it said, written using ChatGPT. Now, we're okay with ChatGPT doing stuff, right? It can write an email for you. It can tell a colleague things. ChatGPT in this instance was doing emotional work. We weren't willing to let ChatGPT do emotional work for us. So there's going to be an interesting interplay between social acceptability and technological capability in that landscape. So that gets to the question, yes, we're going to see transition to labor market, and by that I mean now, like happening now, and will only continue to accelerate. What are the skills that's needed? Easy. Beingness. Looking at you, Fernando. I think one of the big things that you really need to look at is what are the things that can't be duplicated by technology? What is it that technology cannot do well? AI can scale, right? You take one thing that's done once, it can do it again and again and again. But there's attributes of who are we as people? How do we intersect with others? The emotional care structure, there's going to be a massive increase in the care sector, which is already unfunded. Certainly universal basic income is going to be on the table as a significant area of discussion as jobs get replaced or sections of jobs get replaced. So I do think, and this was recently Bill Gates wrote a thing on Gates Notes on the age of AI is officially here. And his argument was, which has been said by others, it's a care economy. It's a things that require physical dexterity that won't be taken over as readily by AI and a number of other aspects. So I think we're going to see parts of the university turn from knowing, like learn this thing, know this thing, understand this thing, to being, be this kind of a person, have these kinds of core attributes, social, affective, emotional capabilities, connecting with others, and increasingly coordinating and integrating with an artificial cognition system. I think will start to become critical literacies.
Thanks, George. As we think about what the future is going to look like for our children, certainly, as they enter the workforce, my question is to Edward, and it's just off the back of how AI is going to affect professions, I suppose, but specifically instructors, professors, academics, researchers. How do you anticipate that AI, could it eventually replace human instructors? You've been talking about, the professor in your pocket, or as Kuan said, the teaching assistant in the pocket. Will there be a need for human educators in the classroom as we move towards more AI?
Okay, I think George has half answered this one. It's unlikely that we're just going to walk through this unscathed. However, I look out on the room at the moment and I'm picking up very quickly, there's some people paying attention, there's some people maybe doing something else. If these are my students and I'm trying to get some sort of instruction going on, it's very quick for me to read them. That's experience, but it's also human. AI really struggles to walk around things, the sort of mechanical versions that we have of this. So it's not easy to do all the human functions that we typically do at the moment. And I'm going to use that caveat pretty much for everything I say, is at the moment. We don't really know how it progresses. I think you could look back at 100 years of history, as George has said, and predicting the future is a mug's game. No one's got it right. And when someone gets some little aspect of it right, they're lauded as some sort of great visionary. Will it replace us? Look, I think the first thing that we'll do, and what I want it to do, is I think about all the things that I absolutely don't want to do. I like marking a little bit. I need to know how my students have been going. Has the tuition worked the way that I wanted to do? But I don't want to mark 200 students. So I'm happy to mark 5 or 6. Okay, things are ticking along nicely here. This works. I expected the student to do well. They've done well. It matches. Go ahead and mark. By the way, thank you very much for providing all the feedback that you did to my students during the term, because I can provide some feedback, but not in the depth that you've managed to do, Mr. AI. Wonderful. So I don't need to give feedback every week because the students can get it from the system themselves. I don't need to mark all their work because the AI system can mark it. And it's been able to do that for 20 years. It's just a training exercise. Now they've got every exercise that's ever been written by a student and turn it in as a source for essentially marking stuff. So I'm quite confident that I won't be marking much stuff in 3 years' time. In 3 months' time, I'm not sure exactly what my courses are going to look like, but they will not look the way they do right now. They will not have assessments that can be broken that easily. They will be much more in-person, engaging stuff, using the students as peers to help their learning. What I'm looking for is, I no longer care about the grades. I'm really much more concerned about the learning and making sure that happens. And I think that is the change that has to happen to the workforce, is we have to accept that there are things that we do not do better than anyone else anymore, because the anyone else is a thing, and it's a very good thing, and it does wonderful stuff. And so we need to make sure that we can supplement what the AI does. Shelley Palmer talked something a little bit about we need to become the best partners of AI as we possibly can be, because we can't replace it anymore. It's replaced a lot of the stuff we don't want to do. It will replace some of the stuff that we do like to do. Creatives are struggling at the moment, just sort of getting their heads around it. But they will find a pathway where they leverage what AI can do for them and turn it into something new and brilliant. We need to do the same thing with our teaching. Our research, does anyone really like writing those introductory paragraphs where we sort of summarize what the literature does? I don't. Do I like referencing? No, I don't even care about referencing, except the fact that it's a convention that we typically do. And so I don't like to bother my students with learning how to reference every particular standard. There's so many styles in the world, can't do it anyway. So I teach them to use EndNote. And so we've got all these tools already in play, and this is just an extension of them moving forwards. We need to focus on the stuff that will make us great supporters of student learning. And then we'll keep our jobs.
Thanks, Edward. Building on that, a question for you, Kuan, is how do we ensure that AI in education is fair and equitable for all our students?
Well, I think fair and equitable has 2 aspects to it. One is the tangible access to resources, the internet, the software, the hardware, for you to be able to even interact with the cloud version of the AI, which is ChatGPT is a cloud version of the AI. And the other aspect is the know-how. You need to know how to use AI to maximize the benefits of using it. So without having the know-how, you can't use the AI to its maximum potential, and that's a barrier in itself. That's the barrier to equitable access. So to address the barrier, the second barrier, which is the know-how, I think, as I said, I want to reiterate that it's our duty as educators, it's our obligation to teach our students and our peers how to use AI wisely, properly, to maximize its benefit and to manage its limitations. And therefore, that barrier will be slowly removed. The second barrier, the first barrier around resourcing, I would argue that decades ago, when we first have computers introduced to education, back then the barrier was a bit higher. So I remember that when I was young, my dad bought a computer for me, and it costed him the entire month's salary. And then now we see that computers are now being widely used in education. And I don't think that the barrier of entry for AI today is that high. I still think there's a little bit of a barrier to it, but because of recently there's a lot of competition amongst the major tech companies. So for example, Microsoft is going to build AI into their productivity tools. Soon, Word, PowerPoint, Excel will have AI built into those tools. Google is countering that by having their tools built into Workspace, their Google Workspace, Gmail, their Google Sheets, Google Docs will have productivity tools with generative AI built into those tools. And that Apple, it's rumored that Apple is doing something with their productivity tools as well. So there will be a transition period, but that transition period won't be long. And due to the major competition, that will drive down the cost of accessing AI. And in the meantime, during this transition period, we can do our part in advocating for our campuses, our schools, our community libraries to have, if these tools become enterprise and become available, to have some of their resourcing put against having these AIs installed into their environments so that more and more people, the community, can access those tools readily.
Thank you, Kuan. We're going to pivot now to questions from the audience. So Negan will move about the physical audience with a roaming mic. So just put up your hand and Negan will come to you in turn, and I'll stand at the back and I will relay questions from our live audience. So, yep, we'll do a bit of a juggle.
Well, there's definitely no shortage of questions. I'll start with you, sir.
Thank you, Megan. George, a question for you. You mentioned creatives and the impact of AI on those. I've recently seen a case where a cartoonist is suing OpenAI because she has clearly recognised her style, her features of her own individual cartoons in stuff that AI is producing. What would you think her chances might be of winning that case? And what implication does it have for us? Because at the University of Adelaide, for example, copyright's advising us not to use generated images for that very reason.
Well, I think the chances are roughly zero. And part of the reason is, it's worth noting, like in some regard, humans' history of knowledge production is ChatGPT. Like, that's what we've done. You know, somebody wrote something, I cite it, I build on it, I create it. Somebody else writes it, builds on that, recreates it. What ChatGPT does is indiscriminately at scale and lightning fast. So what takes us 2,000 years to develop, ChatGPT will do, pretty quickly. So I think I just want to say we've always been recreators. We've always recombined knowledge. We've always relied on what others have done. Maria Popova calls this combinatorial creativity. It's the essence of science, the essence of creation. Anybody who's ever taken an art class starts with, this is in the style of this artist. So we're always doing that. So that's normal. What's abnormal here is there's no linkage to it. Like what the system outputs doesn't have a relationship to the original source. We might be able to recognize a style, but if I'm drawing something and I'm like, oh, this is sort of what Michelangelo would do, but a little better, we still see that source. There's a link to source. If you've played around with tools like Midjourney, just as an example, two illustrations. There's Firefly, which is Adobe's image generation tool set. And then there's Midjourney. Midjourney is just relentlessly reckless. If it finds an image, it consumes it and uses it for future images. Midjourney produces incomprehensibly beautiful pictures. Like it looks like an image that was taken with a camera, not something that was created. Firefly, even though it's still in earlier stages, doesn't have it. The difference is Firefly was trained in a more ethical way, paid attention to copyright and so on. That may change over time. So I'm just trying to say one of the benefits we have now, and this was Sam Altman's testimony in Congress yesterday, or day before it was, he was saying, you know what, maybe we need to regulate AI. What he's really saying is, we got ours, but we don't want these open source companies that are a threat to Google or to theirs to get the same access. So I don't think they're going to be successful with it. I think it's the natural human process, but what's interesting is we're not experiencing it from the lens of, is it beautiful or is it art? We're experiencing it from the lens of, is it economical? Can we make money off of it? So we think we're talking about a creativity question, but we're really talking about an economics question. And that's a completely different scale. And we know the copyright system right now favors big companies and big tech, which means this individual likely will not have much of a chance.
We're going to go to the next question before we jump to our online audience.
Yeah, if I don't understand correctly, please correct me, but as I understand it, AI is based on statistical probabilities around a way of knowing, say within the last few years, up to 2020 for ChatGPT. Yeah? Okay. So with our move in the last few years to try and incorporate more Indigenous, Aboriginal knowledge and other cultural structures and ways of knowing within what we do, how does that fit with that? Because it seems to me that it's creating an orthodoxy that doesn't allow maybe new ways to think, that in terms of how we treat the planet and our resources may be a better way of thinking about the world. So I'm concerned that it's creating units of thinking that can only think one way, and we're, instead of becoming an institution that encourages different ways of interrogating, thinking, incorporating other knowledges, we're making students who can create widgets that fit how things were at the time these tools started generating.
All right. So yes, AI does work in predictive algorithms, and it's backdated to about 2021 at the moment. All temporary stuff, right? Sooner or later, someone's going to pay the bills, and they're going to have every journal on the planet under their belt, and then their referencing will be accurate. I interviewed about 100 creatives over the last 6 months. Started off about technology and their work, and it turned into an AI and technology, an AI and their work going through. The majority were not worried. Yes, they were concerned a little bit that their stuff was being harvested without permission, but they put it up on the internet in the first place. So I think there's that issue where the creatives are not necessarily as concerned. The Indigenous stuff, I think, is really fraught. If you're looking for something that appropriates other cultures, AI does it. It appropriates literally everything. It turns us into one big blending pot and then churns out something. If you ask it to generate some Indigenous art, it will do that, and it will look good enough for the majority of people on the planet. However, at the same time, it deprives people of a livelihood. And we've seen that just recently with some of that creative touch-ups that may have been done on some of the Indigenous work from the Centre of Australia, where some of the art companies have potentially been tidying it up for consumer work. And the problem that's caused that is it's caused massive reputational damage. And so they're not selling as much stuff as they did before. And this is just because of one small, relatively speaking, one small compromise that someone's made to try and sell something to make a buck. So is this a concern? I think it's a huge concern. I think if I was an Indigenous artist at the moment, I would be very worried. I think if I was putting up stuff which I thought was very personal to my culture and it was on the internet, I'd be thinking it's going to get appropriated and it's going to be turned into something that I didn't intend it to be. Worse, it will look absolutely authentic. And I think that's probably the biggest problem with that. These are all sort of social issues that we have to negotiate with with AI in general. The images stuff, you can create stuff in the art style of anyone who's published art of any kind and put it on the internet in recent years. So there's a whole bunch of conversations that have to happen around copyright, royalties, and even just the ability to be able to track down where these potential sources are is really tricky because it's not a big database of stuff. It's generated dynamically every single time. So I don't think I have a solution for you, but there's a bit of a discussion around it.
Just a follow-up to that.
Yeah, sorry. My concern is that even if it is now gathering more data, the data is totally polluted by AI. Most of the data that's going to be created that it can harvest now is going to be created with the assistance of AI. So it becomes iterative, it becomes circular, and it stops any way except a very structured way of thinking happening.
I don't think that's likely to occur, but I'm happy to pass this on to someone else.
So the current system works with also human feedback. So whatever you put into the ChatGPT now, it will. There's a group of people actually reviewing your responses, and then put it against the AI. So that's called, I think, RLHF. So reinforcement learning through human feedback. So we have to make sure that loop back into the AI actually recognizes people of different cultures. And we are not so sure whether this panel who reviews the material that goes back into the AI to train it is really the material that should go in. So who are the humans who are actually sitting behind the panel driving the AI to improve itself? That's a big question mark. And I've read somewhere that you can actually have an enterprise version of an AI. So you can have sort of GPT-4 within your organization and train with your own organization's data. So I would imagine that for a community who want the AI to be localized, I think we have to get our hands on the version that fits better to our needs.
So I just want to, I think what the question being asked is twofold. One is, are we going to have a diminishment of voices outside of the dominant voice in future AI outputs? And I mean, it's possible. I would expect likely it is. It's the dominant hegemonic culture that sometimes takes over. There's been some work in Hugging Face, which is a big AI open source community, has done work with this, and is trying to build language models that are distinct to different cultures. The other thing, and I'm not sure, have you played with some of the AI systems looking specifically at Indigenous knowledge? I'm not quite sure the person that was asking. Have you had a look at some of those interactions in the AI system to see how it
I don't think Indigenous knowledge works on that scale using the presumptions that make us think with the AI. That's the problem, is that the outputs that we do, Indigenous knowledge is traditional, it's community, it's collaborative in a way that I don't think there are right answers in the way that the AI model expects us.
Yeah, have you engaged with it just in asking those types of questions? I think all knowledge has a communal engagement.
No, I'm saying that I don't think that the Indigenous and Aboriginal way of knowing would be to ask a database or use it in that way. It's not even in the same room as what we're talking about. And that's my concern, is they're outside the room, and how are we going to develop our knowledge and our students to understand something really valuable that's been overlooked for so long? How do we incorporate that in their worldviews?
See, so the reason I'm trying to get at that question is the idea these outputs are artifacts, whether the outputs is something that a human has created by hand, whether it is a drawing that's been produced, in a cave setting, whether it is, traditional text that has been written in a book, sort of from the Western lens. I think all of these are types of outputs that intersect with human knowledge systems. And we could argue that all of human history at a biological level has been an optimization of algorithms to produce the human beings and the types of cultures and societies that we have today. So I think in that regard, the question for me becomes, if an artifact or a drawing or a story, which are composed narratives of ways of thinking and being, if those can be captured either audibly or through image or through discussion or through Western curriculum, I think the challenge that I'm up against is, how does AI, because any of those systems now have AI as an active agent in it, And that has really dramatic implications for what we do and teach in our schools and university settings.
I think we're going to, I'm going to throw it over to Scott, who's going to ask the questions that our live audience has been putting into Slido. Scott, you have one for us?
Yeah, thank you, Negan. And for those who are online, keep your questions coming. Look, I've got a question here for Kuan, just on a practical level. A couple of people online have asked a similar question. Kyla, as a tutor, is really keen to get started and just wanting to know where to begin. You spoke before about the obligation of academics to share their work, their knowledge around AI with their peers. You also talked about the imperative of everyone engaging with AI. The question here is, where do I begin and how can we commence sharing? What's the best way to just do that?
Well, firstly, I think you need to get access to the tool. The common tool that people use right now is ChatGPT, right? But there are other tools out there, such as Microsoft Bing, and also Google has Google Bard. But just get your hands into the tool, on the tool. Start by asking it common questions. When I first got the tool got access to the tool back in November, I was using it for a lot of different things, not academic related, not educational related. I got it to, for example, I asked it, how do I remove a hornet's nest from my backyard? And it's able to list step-by-step instructions for me to remove a hornet's nest from my backyard. I could easily Google that, but I wanted to try the tool. I wanted to try what it can and cannot do. And then from there, I started thinking, if I can get instructions on how to remove a hornet's nest, maybe I can get ChatGPT to ask it to improve my teaching, maybe come up with a quiz question. So I gave ChatGPT a passage or a paragraph from one of the textbooks, and it's able to tell me that I was able to prompt it to give me a quiz question based on that paragraph itself. So there are many examples out there, and you can easily Google nowadays, or you can even access ChatGPT to ask it to give you what it can do for you in education. It's able to give you a list of things that you can get it to do. So I would suggest that the people online try that and try what it suggests that you do, and then do it yourself. And that's the first step.
Thank you. Kuan.
Anyone else have a question they want to ask the panel? To you first.
Thanks. Thanks for the talk. This is actually a variant of a question you've been asked, but it's from a slightly different angle. Are you worried about, from the point of view of your own students, I mean, having all these great learning tools and that, and then you're graduating them into a sort of environment where they're not ever going to be able to actually apply them, or at least not get remunerated for them? I mean, I'm currently looking for a postdoc job, and it's already hard because we're graduating too many PhDs, right? Yeah, and I worry by the time the next contract or the next one comes around, it'll just be impossible, and I'll never be able to, my research career will just be done because I can't. Yeah, there won't be any research positions or enough of them for you to get a gig doing that.
Look, this is, I think the better skilled you are, the more you are able to think creatively and differently from everyone else, the more likely it is you're going to still have a role in society moving forwards. And I'm not saying that this is the end of society for people that kind of just like everyone up here. We are just academics who are doing our jobs. Moving from postdoc to academia has always been difficult. I imagine most of us were on contracts for extended periods of time. Mine was well over a decade. And you just work through those things. So that's one side of it. It's just awkward position to try and find yourself in anyway. The other part is that, and it goes a little bit towards what AI can actually do. It's trained, it collects data, it learns, and it provides predictive approaches to questions that we pose it. but it doesn't create the way that we tend to do at the moment. I think humans look at something and they go, well, that's fine. That's the status quo. Let's break it. And that's what every generation tends to do. The Beatles became super famous, but their stuff was some of their stuff was based on Bach, right? But they became famous because they just broke all the rules that were there at the time. And I think, to some extent, our ability to break the rules that will be laid down to us, potentially by a body of work created by AI, is something that is relatively unique. And I don't think that, at least not in the next 5 years, I don't think that that's going to be something that AI can do for us. AI may take us in a completely different direction. It may redefine what creativity is from a non-human perspective. And I'm kind of looking forward to seeing what that might look like, because it will be very alien to us. But I think in terms of our society and the way we're trying to progress it, I think there's still a role for us. And I think there's still jobs for us. And I think it's just a matter of reconstructing how we do them.
Got another question here?
So one of the things when you're talking about, the beingness and the human experience, and that's been a thought that I've had since this whole, since at the end of last year when everybody was getting really upset about it, is that our assessment now will go back to that more personalised connection with the students about beingness, because that's how we're going to have to assess it. And I just wonder what your thoughts are on, we've got this trend of massification of education and packing in as many student numbers as we can get, and now we've got a trend for generative technologies, when we now need to be moving back to that humanness and that connected side of our assessment, and how is this going to impact this idea of massification, like just cram more and more and more students in, particularly when we're talking about students who are in first year. And I guess the reason I think about this is because, I don't know if people are familiar with the movie WALL-E, a little robot, and there was a ship and everybody was dumb as dirt and was in the ship and just living it on. And I feel like, oddly prophetic that movie could become, because the most important thing we have is teaching our students how to question. And I teach biostats, and we often will give them just a data set that's just rubbish and let them put it in, and it generates a number, and we'll ask them to interpret it. And then you'd have that conversation. Well, you can put it in and garbage comes out, because when you put garbage in, garbage comes out. And I kind of see AI, people using it in that way without that questioning. So how do you think this AI will influence this massification and how our classroom structures look?
I'm going to pass this on, but I think the basic stuff that we do, perfectly suited for massification if you want. And I think the need for us to actually have more people on the ground in our classes with our students is great. In a way, it answers the question that was just asked, is that I think if we're going to go through this Socratic process, if we're going to move away from the gut reaction of just saying we're going to have to examine everything, we think about, do we have to even assess everything? How can we assess learning in other ways that maybe involves more people and more interactions with people, more interactions with students and their peers and industry as well? And there's a whole range of things we can do in terms of human interactions that are really important in terms of developing learning. I've said enough. Who wants it?
I think one angle is that, there are multiple ways of being and multiple ways of knowing. And James Bridle had an interesting book on that recently, where he looked at exactly that, the way that nature knows and the way that being in nature, impacts humans. We're not a brain in a vat, from that regard. And in some ways, AI does reduce us to just brains and vats. We feel our emotions in our body. We are intelligent in a body. We are intelligent in a culture. We are intelligent in a society. And so I think it's possible that multiple ways of knowing might be amplified, just like you suggested, that maybe as AI does this strand of knowing, which in some ways has been the totality of much of what we do in universities, AI may end up being a thing that pushes us into those care sectors or into those connected with one another sectors, because that we can't massify, at least not yet.
Scott's got a question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, before you go on, I just wanted to add something because I heard it on the radio this morning and I thought that it just ties so nicely in that humans will still be needed. What was the metaverse that has now imploded? And the Facebook metaverse that we all heard about the last few years, especially while we were in lockdown, and it was touted as being, this is what's going to be the future of our social structure. And I just found it so poignant that it's been announced that it's completely folded as a concept and will no longer remotely be viable because those social structures need real people. So the notion that it's fine to just all hang out in a virtual world is not really a reasonable future at the moment. At least it's not a financially viable future at the moment, and didn't have enough buy-in. I think that kind of sends us a message that humans are still valuable and important to this whole story.
Thank you. I've got some more questions online. So I've got a question for Edward here. Someone's asking, if you do use AI tools to give feedback to students, are you concerned about pushback from students who would prefer to get feedback from a human being? Might students start questioning why they need us at all?
They definitely will, and they definitely should. But I think we should be able to answer that question as well. Preliminary research only, but it does seem that students are much more likely to trust feedback from academic staff, hooray, which is not surprising, right? It's all they've ever learned. They probably haven't had a chance to play around with ChatGPT, and they certainly haven't had any chance to verify the credibility of it compared to what we can do as academics. So I think students should feel rightfully a little bit cautious, but I don't think it'll take them long to realise they're actually getting some really sensible, good quality feedback that we can't actually provide on mass. So this is massification again, right? But we actually push it out to the students to actually interact with systems to find that. Where they strike problems, we come in again.
Moving on from how to best engage students, I've got another question around how do we get the university to consider higher level issues. So, for example, is the university thinking about how this is going to shift the funding paradigm? For instance, are we going to keep on paying for databases and online journals? Surely this model should challenge the system of academic publishing.
Who wants to take that one?
I'll take step one. Look, I think there's places for journals. I mean, we need original content. We need to have original research being generated, and there needs to be a structure to support that. And in the end, it boils down to who's going to pay for access to that content. Now, if I'm running a journal, which I'm not, but if I was running a decent journal, I'd be having conversations right now, and I'm sure I have been for months, with these AI engines and saying, look, we want to make sure that we stay in business. We want to sell you our output so you can add it to your database. We want to see a database, an AI that is based on genuine human knowledge, not everything that's on the internet, but something which has actually come from a learned academy. So I think that's kind of how I will be trying to push the monetary side of that, in which case there's still valid use for having access to publish this stuff for free from universities. Someone has to pay for it, so universities are paying for it. The AI engines are paying, the AI engine people, they're paying an annual salary. I think it works reasonably well at a superficial level, which is all I've really thought about it.
Look, I've got another question for George here. As educators, we're interested in enabling real learning. Will AI make us more intelligent as educators, as students, and as people? Will we change our idea of what intelligence is within education?
It's a tough one to answer from a future sense. I think AI makes us more intelligent by broadening our network of access. So, for example, we've, over the last, century, likely moved away from the idea of sort of explicit individual intelligence as the primary marker of scientific advancement. We won't have another Einstein in history, most likely, by that definition of intelligence. I think we're intelligent in networks. We're intelligent in social systems. So I think from that lens, AI definitely makes us more intelligent because there can be rudimentary things. There's a paper in Nature that Johnson did in 2013 where he looked at trends, these microbursts of stock market fluctuations. And one of the things they found out was that this market, AI, algorithms, trading with algorithms was moving so fast, to use a term that there's no place for humans to intervene. And we're going to have greater swaths of our lives where there will be no place for humans to intervene in some of the automated structures that we've created. Certainly in a military sense, that's the case in greater and greater swaths. Business sense, that's happening. Even in some cases, medical diagnosis, AI is an active agent in that. So the question for me becomes, if AI takes over a lot of these cognitive activities that humans have done traditionally, then what does that allow us to do, or what does that free us up to do? Because we're not going to just sit there and look at a wall. We're going to engage in these discussions in a more significant way. So I absolutely think AI has the capacity to make us more intelligent by being an agent within our overall network of intelligence. But I think also AI has the capacity to make us more human by freeing up our time to do the care work and the connecting work.
Great, thank you. I've got one more from the live stream, a practical question for Narelle. If we do decide to use ChatGPT to support us in creating our own teaching tools, how might we reference this to model the right example to our students? Wonderful
question. It goes back to how you acknowledge and reference traditionally. It's actually not much different. It's quite similar to how you might reference a journal, or how you might reference a communication with a colleague. So it's looking at how you ask the questions and the prompts, explain what you did in developing that material, and acknowledge the source that you garnered that from. Something that all of these models have in common is that they have a statement that they're provided for you to use on the understanding that you don't pass off that content that it produces as your own. So really you're just referencing it like you would any other tool or citation that you might make.
Got time for a couple questions. I'm going to go here and then I'm going to go there. I'm closer to this one.
Hi. So following on, interplay between AI and academic integrity, and the analogy of having a sort of red light, yellow light, and green light system, and the whole question of citing, how do we actually move ourselves from the red light to the green light? Because even with the conversation about citing using AI, this tends to send us, sort of as institutions, back to the red light and sort of trying to find ways to sort of catch students or to show that people are doing the wrong thing. And so how do we get to the point when we are just firmly in the green light and we don't worry about sort of the nitty-gritty details, whether the citation was complete, whether it was made, whether it's not made? It's more about the sort of learning side rather than the citing side of learning.
I think that comes back down to assessment design. So if we're designing assessment with the way students are going to carry this out in mind and with our academic integrity policies in mind, then we can work backwards and be sure that what we're asking the students to do is not only authentic, but it isn't able to be easily broken by generative AI tools. If a student can simply spend 2 minutes in generative AI and produce something, is it really something we need them to do? Because my answer to that would be probably not. If it's that easy for the tool to do, I think we need to rethink what it is we actually want them to learn out of that process. And to give some background, I'm quite shocked to hear myself say this, because my PhD was on helping students learn how to write. So generative AI turned up and turned my research on its head. So I had to really rethink what was it that was most valuable about the learning to write kinds of models that I was using. And it really wasn't just the physical writing. It's really the analysis and the types of things that the generative AI models might be okay at, but they really can't pinpoint some of those things that we're asking our students to do. But I don't think the answer is all the way at the extreme of invigilated exams either. They have their place, but I don't think that that's the switch that we really need to be making to move towards everything being a green light and not having to worry about a very clear plagiarism detection models. It's really thinking about the specific things you want your students to do and coming up with more creative ways to get them to demonstrate that learning. And by what we've heard today, if we can push off some of our academic load using some of these generative AI models, we can spend more time doing that. And that's where we're valuable.
I might just add to that. I think we need to interrogate why we do what we do. It's kind of like the calculator problem. So those of you who were kicking around in the 70s would remember the fight to the death that teachers had amongst themselves about whether calculators should be allowed in schools because it damaged mental arithmetic. I think the answer is, yeah, it probably does damage mental arithmetic, but where's the value? What is it that we value the most with the time that we have to enable the teaching? For example, cursive, still taught in schools for some incomprehensible reason. The reason we teach cursive is because we didn't want blobs of ink to happen from fountain pens. It's not got anything to do with genuine learning or hand-eye coordination. The rationale was to save blobs on paper. So we need to think about all the things that we've been doing for so many years and whether they are the appropriate things to be doing to maximise learning outcomes for our students.
Can I just jump in there? I'm just going to paraphrase a question along those lines from the audience here, Edward, and it's around the idea of producing critical thinkers. And does this give us an opportunity to redesign our assessment so our focus is now more on critical assessment, critical thinking, critical analysis, where they're putting in the right prompts, they're analysing the output, they're doing something with it that is more meaningful and a higher order?
Yes, I think once we understand how to do that properly ourselves, that will be my answer, is absolutely yes.
Yeah.
I agree to that. We first need to understand what the tool can and cannot do. It can already do certain basic level of reflection. So you can, for example, ask the tool, like my lecture slide example. You can actually put into the tool and ask it to improve. So that's on itself is critical thinking, isn't it? Getting a tool to think about where the gaps are within the content and to be able to generate some sort of improvement to the content itself. But then what is the next level? How do we actually go to the next level and prompt the tool to maybe give us something harder than just a plain reflection? So we know that for normal knowledge questions, that's totally easily being able to be answered by the tool. So for example, what is a budgeting model? So that kinds of questions, the tool will be easily be able to answer. But then you go to the next level, critique this budgeting model, but the tool can already do that. They can already critique what a budgeting model looks like and how do you improve the existing budgeting model. So you need to go down to the next level. So what the next level looks like, well, I'm still testing.
We'll find out. We've got time for just one more question, and Megan's got one from the floor.
The one from the floor is going to have to be pretty good. You've been waiting a long time.
Thank you. It's both blessing and curse being the last, because it's a curse that most of my question has already been asked/answered, which is could be also a blessing as well. So, but it's a rhetorical thing. So, both from West, from Hellenic Greece, and from East, from Confucianism, for thousands of years, we humans been taught and trained to create new knowledge through listening, reading, and then comprehending, and then trying to create something in terms of narrative storytelling, creative way, in our own words, through our own brain, cognitive effort. And based on that, we measure the achievement and merit, and we put the place of individuals within society. And obviously, that process is interrupted now and interrupted for good. What's the kind of, in that sense, so where is the place, how to basically, let's say, decide which individuals are good enough not to get into that most ideally way into that universal income, and which individuals are going to be considered as a worth of being, and creating those being spaces where they can use their cognitive advancement and produce, let's say, better outcome for humankind. That's a question, and my rhetoric is, do we need to put stronger emphasis in terms of the assessment on oratory aspect if the artificial intelligence is going to create the content, storytelling, that cognitive, then shall we check that knowledge through training students to get back into old-fashioned oratory aspect of answering and creating knowledge?
Well, I'm going to pass this one along as well, but there's already systems which will be able to represent my voice and the way I speak, and can tell a story based in the way that I tend to tell stories. So I think a lot of the things that we're thinking of are a little bit sacrosanct. They're not. I think a lot of the things that we think can't be done can be done. It won't be long before we break the uncanny valley with visual representations of humans, and then you're going to have a indiscernible picture of me talking properly in my voice about the things that I typically talk about, except maybe someone might just bend it a little bit into something I don't want it to be, and there's a problem around that. But so I think the premise there is that it actually can be done already. So that's be wary. But in terms of selecting people who might be part of getting sort of a universal salary, I'm going to pass that on to the person that introduced it.
Well, our current economic model is young-ish. Like, there was a time where people got along reasonably well, sort of sustaining and living on the land and, existing that way. I think one of the things that has sort of an undeniable truth is technology creates problems that only more technology can solve, right? That's the loop that we're within. We don't know how to exit that necessarily. If you look at, if we reduce death rates so that people aren't dying when they're in their 30s or their 40s, well, people live longer and we need to take care of them longer and we need better medicines, and the list goes on. And then we create technology that allows us to be globally connected. Well, now we're globally connected, and now state level actors like to intervene in elections and produce sort of, bipartisan discussions in society. So now we add new technology to try and solve that problem. That was Zuckerberg's, testimony in front of Congress a number of years ago, where AI was going to be the solution. The reality is AI is going to create some opportunities for us, but it's also going to create a lot of opportunities, or a lot of challenges, I should say. And guess what the problem to that is going to be? Or the solution, I should say. It'll be more technology at some level. So we are in an incredible loop that I don't know if we can break from it, at least not in a world where you've got 7, 8, 9 billion people existing at the same time. We need the agriculture system that has been massified in order to feed those people. These are the challenges, I guess, that we have. So there are alternative ways of existing in the world, and I think there's a lot to be learned from cultures that have managed to do that. I know in Hawaii, for example, there's been a return to some of the land management practices that traditional Hawaiians are able to do. At one point, Kauai, one of the islands, sustained about 1 million people who didn't use our massified technology system. Now there's 80-some thousand people, and when COVID hit, they would have been without food in less than 2 weeks because everything was part of a global supply chain. So we are living in the world that we envisioned or either let unfold, and I think there's a big question on, do we want a different world? And the universal basic income is one part of that question. It's a reduction in growth like growth as in everything. We need more and more and more every year. That's one response to it. It's a reorienting expectations on how to exist in a world that turns toward relationships away from economic gain. But this is the work of philosophers and religious leaders that they've grappled with for millennia. And I think at this point, the economic system that we're in, I don't think we know how to get off of this technology economic treadmill that we're on, which means tomorrow will give us more of the same that we have today.
On that note, I think we have come to the end of our panel.
Yeah, that is all the time that we have. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, those in the room and online. But more importantly, I'd like to extend a hearty thank you to our panel members today, George, Edward, Kuan and Narelle. Thank you for giving up your time, but also for sharing your expertise with us. It's a fascinating topic, and that proliferation of webinars, seminars and academic conversations that continue, we can all continue engaging with that. So thanks again for your time, and
And just before we go, can we please put our hands together for Scott and Negan for organising this, and for Shane, who's managed to stream it all for us. Thank you, mate.